People forget fascism has existed since after World War II. In fact, you can see it in everyday life in the workforce. A great interview by David Graeber is Chuck Mercer's This Is Hell interview about bureaucracy. Is this even capitalism anymore? Social democracy, fascism, state communism are a lot more similar in certain structural ways than any of them want to admit. Contrary to popular belief, 95% of the daily bureaucracy either has nothing to do with government or comes with weird public-private hybrid rules and laws. As David Graeber finds it quite fascinating how our participation in bureaucratic environment makes us feel and act stupid. It really is a form of utopianism, since people never fit in the prescribed frame of rules. It used to be left-wing critique pointing out the similarity between social democracy, fascism, and state communism. Now, it's the right saying the welfare state is both communist and fascist at the same time. However, the landscape has changed and a new financial corporate bureaucracy has emerged. It's the beginning of an era of total bureaucratization. We have the world's first planetary bureaucrat administration, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. We're supposed to think that market just comes around all by itself, but in fact it never does. Financialization of capitalism that occurred when the gold standard was abandoned in 1971 has to do with the long-term historical cycle of alternation between periods of virtual money and periods of bullion money. Periods of the latter where when people were using physical money in everyday transactions tend to be dominated by mass war, empire, standing armies, often slavery, and now we have wage slavery. Democracy is an unrealized ideal. The hope for something else, a forward democracy profoundly anti-bureaucratic, never goes away. Social democracy, fascist state terrorist, and communism are a lot more similar than most people give credit to. Chuck Mertz and his words, the total, brutal, oppressive bureaucracy we find ourselves living today is a creation of our own choosing. Here to tell us how we can still choose another way before it's too late. David Graeber's book, The Utopian Rules on Technology, Stupidity, and the Secret Joy of Bureaucracy. David Graeber, thanks for having me. Chuck Mercer, right? Nowadays, nobody talks about bureaucracy. But in the middle of the last century, particularly in the late 60s, early 70s, the word was everywhere. Everyone seems to feel that the foibles and absurdities of bureaucratic life and bureaucratic procedure were one of the defining features of modern system. As such, immensely worth discussion. But since the 1970s, there's been a peculiar folly. What to you, David Graeber, is explain this fully off? It's not like work life is any less bureaucratic simply because he has become paperless. Do you think that's part of it? In his response, that it's not actually paper. This was part of it, but part of it too has to do with changing assumptions about bureaucracy. When we hear the word bureaucracy, we think big government, civil service, pointy-headed bureaucrats like George Wallace made the expression famous. It's always referred to annoying government people who are trying to limit the market and limit our free ability to talk and bother engage in free contracts. The moment the word bureaucracy, people start talking about the government, but in fact, 95% of the government that they deal with day to day either has nothing to do with government at all, or is this weird synthesis of public and private, at which point distinction between corporate bureaucracy and government bureaucracy are almost meaningless. Examples of banks. On the phone call with Bank of America because they introduced this new security system and it became impossible to check someone's account from outside the United States. Trying to figure out how you could check your account. It took about an hour. It, you get bounced back and forth between 17 desks and had to render all sorts of data 4 or 5 times because they kept losing it. Classic bureaucrat runaround, right? Now, was that public or private? It's a private bank. But if you complain to the bank, they always say the same thing. Well, there are all these government regulations that really ties our hands. It's complicated. But if you look at how they actually come up with those government regulations, half of it is written by the bank. They have their lobbyists, they come up with a proposal, they give a lot of money to politicians, they sit down with them and they work something out. So the banks write the regulation which the government used to regulate it, but also to regulate us. Almost everything we do is regulated by these weird public-private hybrid rules and laws. As Democrat right, how the mainstream left, or what is supposed to pass with the left these days, has come to offer little more than a watered-down version of the right wing's language when it comes to being critical of bureaucracy. Bill Clinton, for instance, has spent so much of his career bashing civil service that after the Oklahoma City bombing, he actually felt moved to remind Americans that public servants were human beings unto themselves, and promised never to use the word bureaucrat again. Why are bureaucrats such a veritable target when it's something we depend on so much? Why do they seem to lack a voice? Because our actual experience of bureaucracy is one of annoying, officious people who make you feel like an idiot. This is something that as an anthropologist, David Graeber, find quite fascinating. Why is it that if we are in a bureaucratic environment, not only is the whole thing set up to make us feel like an idiot, but we actually start to act like an idiot? Like, he likes to think that David Graeber is a smart guy, but he finds himself and for the out forms just making obvious stupid mistakes. Then when people look at them and like I'm an idiot, I'm like, oh my god, they're right. I put the thing on the wrong line. There's something about the experience which is essentially humiliating. Bureaucracy is a form of utopianism. The classic right-wing critique of state socialism of countries like the Soviet Union is that it's utopia. They have this idealized image of how people should behave if they make up a whole set of rules trying to shape them. But people wouldn't fit in that shape, and when people don't act like they're supposed to do and break the rules, instead of re-examining the rules, they say the people are inadequate and they punish them. But what's basically how bureaucracies always work. The amazing thing is exactly the type of bureaucratic utopianism has now become a major engine for profit accumulation in capitalism. If you look at 2009, the last figure that are available, the biggest banks in America was JP Morgan Chase. 71% of their profit comes from fees and penalties. Basically, what they do for a living is make a rule that they know you can't follow, and then when you don't follow them, they fine you. That's how they make their money. So why does there seem to be a mainstream political consensus in favor of this public-private bureaucracy? There is some critique. The right wing, for example, is divided into two halves. There's the conservative, authoritarian, fascist half. Let's say, then there's this libertarian free market half. The libertarian have critique of bureaucracy and the fascists have critique of the markets. Fascists are all for the welfare state. They just want it only for the white people. And both have some critique of the bureaucratic corporate market fusion. But the mainstream left doesn't have a critique of either. I mean, they're not allowed to promote actual left-wing policies in America. Real left policies are just ruled out from the beginning, because the institutional left hasn't come to terms intellectually with the way that capitalism has changed. In the 60s, there was a real left-wing critique of bureaucracy. If you listen to music from the 60s, they're complaining about bureaucrats and government civil servants and the kind of stuff just as much as they complain about capital, if not more so. At the time, this was a critique of corporatism. We had these giant corporations where the workers were really loyal to the company, and the company has loyal to the workers, and the result politically was kind of scary. It's Archie Bunker territory. This runway worker class that's hyper-nationalist that sees finance as the enemy. The corporation is the big happy family, and the investors are outsiders. The most extreme form of that is fascism, where they want to kill the outsider. They assume that financiers are some type of Jew and want to if they off them. Nonetheless, the corporatist model was very common. As a result, social democracy, fascism, and Marxist-style communism were a lot more similar in certain structural ways than many people want to admit. The left-wing critique is always to point at that out. Now it's the right wing, they do it for they compare welfare state as both communist and fascist. But that critique no longer has anything to do with what's going on, because in the 70s, the upper echelon of the corporate bureaucracy, who used to be simply loyal to the company, there was a lifetime employment. They sold themselves as basically in the business of, say, making cars or perfume or food or whatever. Those guys essentially fused with the financial class, and both of them together became this new financialized corporate bureaucracy. This is the thing that changed the whole landscape. The first half of the 20th century was basically American corporate capitalism and German corporate capitalism ducking it out, or which would become the successor of England. America won, obviously. And what was the first thing America does when it takes over the world? It immediately set up a planetary bureaucracy. We get the United Nations, International Money Fund, the World Bank, all these things. We talk about financialization. That's what happened. These guys became the same people. The financial sector became corporatized. We have all these hedge funds and whatnot, and we have this profound change in what the CEOs of the top corporate bureaucracy think they're trying to do. It's all about profits. They're getting paid in stock options. That wasn't really the big concern back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Now, when that happens, there's a gigantic cultural transformation. That's the beginning of what some people call the era of total bureaucratization. So, Is the mainstream left hesitant to criticize this or even recognize that we're in this total bureaucracy because of the fear of being anti-capitalist, or is the fear of being critical of capitalism? This is part of it. It's a fear of being critical of capitalism. It's also a fear of giving up the last little thing that we do have left over from the 60s and 70s, the little bits of welfare state. So much of the left is on the defensive, and of course they are afraid to attack the beast itself, so it's a loser game. In order to actually take offensive again, we got to size out what the system is, as it actually exists, and what an alternative to it, taking into account the major change that happened, will actually look like. It's not even clear that the system we have, which clearly operates on red extraction, this utopian imposition of rules you can't follow, defining you, is actually capitalism. I mean, we can argue over definitions, but back when he was in school, they told us that capitalism is you take your profits indirectly through wage differentials by producing and selling things and exploit labor. When you take money directly via procedural political means, that's called feudalism. What we got now is a lot more like that. So David Graeber wrote how Americans are really good at bureaucracy, but if they're so good, then why is attacking bureaucrats such a winning if they're such a winner politically? Are they ashamed at how good they are at bureaucracy? So David Graeber came up with a funny formula. Imagine live in England. England people are almost proud of the fact they are so bad at bureaucracy. Everything goes wrong all the time, and everyone likes, well, what do you do is bad? Come on. When he came to London, the first day he started noticing about all these signs on all the public amenities and official buildings saying, please do not physically attack the petty officials. You think normally that would go without saying, but after a month or two, I understood it's really annoying. On the other hand, America is the exact opposite. They're proud that they're proud of being bad. In America, they're ashamed of being good at it. And you could guess the Germans are probably being good at it, and Russians are ashamed of being bad at it. So there's a complete four-part set, all the logical permutations. It's something that America is a German country that doesn't want to admit it. Think about it. There are more people of German descent than British descent in America. And what are our nation's national foods? The hamburger, the frankfurter. How did that happen? So we're really good at bureaucracy. How much do we own bureaucracy for America's success as superpower? If you look at the history, it was America and Germany that invented corporate capitalism. The British and the East India Company and all that stuff, but the South Sea bubble in the 1690s put an end to that. Its real heyday during the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian period. British capitalism was mostly little companies. It was a bureaucratic. They have high finance and then they have family firms. It was the Americans and the Germans who invented corporate bureaucratic capitalism. Guys like Andrew Carnegie or the robber barons were really the founders of bureaucratic firms. You could say that the first half of the 20th century was basically American corporate capitalism and German corporate capitalism talking out over which would become the successors of America One. And what's the first thing they do? Create the United Nations. So we had the world's first planetary bureaucratic administration, which nobody really talks about as much, but there's a major innovation in the world history that's entirely American creation. So, if you point out, it may actually be what the Occupy movement was protesting, whether they knew it or not, the entire global justice movement. So you go back in the Occupy Wall Street at the time that was taking place, how will you explain to an occupier that this is about anti-bureaucratization critique? It is just ask them who's administering their banking. The student loan debt? How that happened? Who created it? Who's in charge of administrating it? Who comes after you if you don't pay on time? You don't really have to explain it. People are and were well aware that the banks and the government are basically the same thing. Back in 1999 to 2000, it was a little harder to explain that to the people because it haven't hit them personally. There is where all of this rhetoric about third world debt and the free market and globalization. Somehow the internet and free trade is uniting us in all these spontaneous movements. If we look at what actually happened, there was institutions like the IMF and World Bank which were imposing their way onto countries all over the world, and that also include transnational corporations, include NGOs. There was this global bureaucratic network being set up, so that even in terms of social policy, you're living in Nepal, chances are some NGO decide your orbit planning from Chicago or Switzerland or something like that. It's a planetary bureaucracy. The thing is, we're not supposed to see it. We're supposed to think the market just comes around all by itself, but in fact, it never does. If we look at the history of England or America, places where we seem like free market system, it's very specific government policy that create those markets and maintain them. We start doing the same thing on the global level. All we were doing at the famous, you know, okay, WTO protests in Seattle, for example, was pointing out the excess that these institutions nobody knew about. For the most part, before that, they say in politics, all you have to do is point. That's not really true. But in this case, it was. All you have to do was like, look, there's this thing for the IMF. And the IMF was already kicked out almost every country on earth. It was kicked out in East India. It was completely kicked out in Latin America. There are two countries in Caribbean where they cannot operate. Anywhere else, they persona non grata. It's interesting that nobody knows this. This is how successful the global justice movement was. So we're going to get the media to write what we thought was wrong with the IMF. We're going to get phrases like structural adjustment policy into the news. We try so hard. We say it over and over again. Reporters were like, no, we're not going to do that. They wouldn't explain to anybody why we were protesting, but in a way, they didn't have to, because all we had to do was point out that these institutions exist. Look, there's this global bureaucracy telling people all over the world how to run the economies and what to do no matter who they elect. That was enough. Nobody been aware of it, and as soon as they knew, they were not very happy about it. And the global justice movement had very clear results. Have you heard of the world debt crisis recently? No, there isn't one anymore. Why is that? It's because of the Occupy Wall Street. If they basically did it, it's quite remarkable if you look at the history. Latin America, I might bet that was, I don't have it as a number, but it was some crazy like $80 billion in 2001. And by 2004, they basically got rid of it. It all happened because of Argentina. There was a direct part of the global justice movement. There was a series of largely non-violent anarchist uprising against the series of governments after the financial crash there, and people started doing exactly what the movement was doing everywhere. They started setting up indie media centers, popular assemblies, alternative currency systems. They started occupying factories. The slogan was, que se vayan todos. They can all go to hell. Fuck all politicians. We don't need them. We're going to create our own society. Ignore them. And 1/3 of Argentina was basically an anarchist society for a while. Essentially, what they were doing was exactly what Americans were doing occupied, which was telling the politicians to prove to us that they were in any way relevant to our real problems, and carry on without them. And that was incredibly successful. The end result was that politicians finally did have to do something, so default on the Argentinian death. The guy who did it was Nestor Kirchner, who was extremely mild social democrat. He never would have done something like that if people had worked within the system like everybody else tell them they're supposed to, like starting a petition and running candidates. Nothing would have happened. By delegitimizing the whole system, they brought things to an impasse where Kirchner had to do something really dramatic. So he did. And set a shockwave. One thing led to another, and IMF was ultimately kicked out of almost every country on Earth. The IMF was kicked out of East Asia, Latin America, and most of the Caribbean. And it's interesting story to note this is how successful the global justice movement was. In fact, within a few years, the IMF itself was on the point of bankruptcy. It was only the crisis in Europe itself that gave them a new lease on life, an excuse for existence. So, do you believe, David Graeber, financialization of capitalism that occurred when we went off the gold standard 1971 set in motion long-term change that will ultimately spell the end of capitalism entirely? I know it's from an earlier book, but why does financialization mean the end of capitalism? As David Graeber responds, well, it has to do with a long-term historical cycle of alteration between periods of virtual money and periods of ballooning money. He can go on into the whole argument here, but basically, when you start looking into it, you know there's the fascinating consistent historical pattern that occurs across every Asian continent, all the way back from 3 to 4,000 years ago to the present. First, there was virtual credit money. Originally, everything is on credit. There's were only coins in ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt, for example. Everywhere else is money. It's a virtual unit of account. And then there are periods dominated by bullion, where people are actually using physical money in everyday transactions. Those periods tend to be dominated by mass war, empires, and the armies, often slavery, and there was chattel slavery across Eurasia the first time. They did this around 800 BC to 800 AD. And then the Middle Ages returned to virtual money again, and this was a long cycle where those empires and the armies and largely slavery all disappear across the area. With virtual money, there's always had to be some mechanism to protect debtors against creditors. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to go crazy. Now, capitalism, of course, belongs to one leg of this cycle, where we go back to Bologna, starting around 1450, taking on after Christopher Columbus came to the Americas. This old scholar civil movie across the ocean, and once again, we get to stand the armies and the empires in slavery. Este, democracy is the idea that people like oh, take over their affairs collectively in reasonable and relatively egalitarian fashion. Therefore, democracy is profoundly anti-democratic. That's the thing which always gives me hope. Now we have wage slavery, which is really just a variation of the same thing. If Aristotle were here, I would say he would definitely think that most Americans are slaves. Because in the ancient world, the distinction between someone who sells himself because he's in debt to work or somebody else and somebody who rents themselves out every day because he's in debt. To work for somebody else is not really a distinction. It's a legal technicality, but it's basically the same thing. So we have this system that has corresponding time almost entirely with one Lego circle, which is now shifting radically to the other way. And of course, at first we try to do everything all wrong. Normally, when there is a system of credit money, you have to set up money institution to protect debtors, to make sure the thing doesn't get out of hand. So if you have jubilees, you can cancel the debt, or you have anti-usury laws, or you just ban taking interest entirely. Something like that has been to be done. Instead, we set up the IMF and institutions like that which are designed to do the exact opposite, to protect creditors against debtors. What's the result? We had nothing but debt crisis and economic disaster ever since. It's been completely unstable. It's completely unworkable. However, the long term, you got to come up with something. But there's really no reason to assume that something is going to be capitalism. Other reason to assume it won't be. For one thing, the system we have is looking less and less like capitalism already. As I said, most profits are now being taken through rent and direct extraction. Corporations and governments are fusing together. I don't know how much the average American income is just already taken by private sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, but it's pretty big. If we consider just mortgages and student loans, it seems to be somewhere between 20 to 40% of median household income. It's interesting that numbers what are real. You can get numbers such as about anything else, but for that one, you can't. But is that capitalism anymore? They always say capitalism. There may not be wage labor factories yet, it's behind it, but it was already capitalism, but that's where it's going to be. There's a historical trajectory which moves in that direction. Well, if that's the case, how do we know the future historian will say whether the next thing is? We're in that now? It's not even capitalism anymore. It's something that only will they take form maybe 2150. So, David, one last question for me. As always, it's the question from hell. The question we might hate to ask, you might hate to answer, our audience to respond to hate the response. You're right, in contemporary American populism, increasingly in the rest of the world as well, there can only be one alternative to bureaucracy, and that is the market. Something that is held to mean the government should be run more like a business. Something that is held to mean we should simply get a bureaucrats out of the way and let nature take its course, which means letting people tend to businesses of their lives untrammeled by endless rules and regulation imposed on them from above, and so allowing the magic of marketplace to provide its own solution. Democracy thus came to mean the market. Bureaucracy, in turn, covered interfering with the market. And this is pretty much what the word continues to mean in this day. But in this definition of democracy, where democracy is not at all with the market, but is in the market, how much is that step towards fascism? How much is it total bureaucratization a step towards fascism? Well, they were braver things, where we're getting resemble certain aspects of fascism and depart from others. Traditional fascism was based on corporatism. It's based on the idea that workers supposed to have common interests in their bureaucratized corporations. This was really the ideology where Mussolini said fascism is corporatism. That's what he meant. There is no class contradiction. We are all in it together in this sort of nationalist thing. We're not going to have that kind of fascism. We have instead is this almost individualistic fascism, where everyone is like a little fascist corporation. Everyone is like a little fascist nation. This is why I think those who self-actualization movement in the 70s were really all about. All the language of this new bureaucratization excel in quality, stakeholders, and best practices traced back to this individualistic fascist attitude. Everything is caused by you. You're responsible for everything that happens to you. It's a triumph of the will on the individual level. So there are traces of fascism, but fascism is reworked into this hyper-individualistic form. When it comes to democracy, democracy has always been an inspiration. It's always pointed this out. It's not been an inspiration of people in power, though. If you look at it, it's nowhere in the U.S. Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. It doesn't say anything about American being a democracy. Those guys hated democracy. They were completely against it. They set up a system to stop democracy. They said so. Read the Federalist Papers. Democracy is the idea that people, if left alone, can govern their affairs collectively uh, and pursue trying to move forward. And that form of democracy is profoundly anti-democratic. That's the thing. We always get something hope. It never goes away. People really believe it. Most Americans love the idea of democracy. They just hate the politicians and are suspicious of government. Well, the obvious they will don't think democracy is a matter of electing politicians who run a government. Say they don't like those things. It's something else. And something else, the fact we all love it, but we don't quite know what it is. This is what gives me hope. So yeah, this is the thing. Our organizational structure, from Soviet Union to the fascist states to Montevideo liberalism, has the same foundation: a bureaucratized financial structure based on the principles of hierarchy, the state, and centralized authority. The three things that should be abolished and ought to be abolished.